The 17th of May, 1943, 12:28 a.m. Just 60 feet above the twisting black ribbon of the Mona River, the trees blur past like jagged bayonets. The engines of Lancaster AJG bellow in thunderous harmony, 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins screaming at full throttle. The bomber, heavy with steel and nerves, cuts through the German night like a ghost with fire in its belly. Inside the cockpit, Wing Commander Guy Gibson's knuckles whiten on the yoke. Sweat gathers under his leather flight cap, cold against his skin despite the frigid wind rushing through the open side window. Every second, every foot of flight is calculated. There is no room for mistake. Not at this speed. Not at this altitude. Not with 1,000 lives downstream. The crew is silent, but each man knows the stakes. Below them, the Mona Dam, one of Germany's critical hydroelectric arteries, and their target for tonight's top-secret raid, Operation Chastise. A mission born in the mind of inventor Barnes Wallis, refined by engineers, and now trusted to a handful of young men flying purpose-built Lancasters aircraft many Germans had mocked as oversized and lumbering. The flying barn, they scoffed. They would learn tonight that barns can fly and they can destroy. Bomb doors open. Gibson orders, voice calm but sharp. Below his feet, the specially modified bomb bay holds an invention unlike any other. A massive cylindrical device, the upkeep mine, primed to spin backwards at 500 revolutions per minute. It's not meant to drop like any ordinary bomb. It's meant to skip across the water like a stone. 1, 2, 3 bounces, then detonation at the dam's base. In theory, the bomb aimer counts down. Steady, steady, now. The release lever clicks. The bomb drops. From the rear blister, tail gunner Sergeant Hutchinson watches in awe as the upkeep slams into the moonlit surface, skipping like a demon's pebble toward the dam wall. It strikes thump, then sinks with an eerie calm. Seconds stretch, no explosion. Then the earth heaves. A column of white water and shattered masonry erupts hundreds of feet into the air. Shock waves ripple through the valley like the pulse of a giant. Trees bend. Windows shatter in villages miles away. And then silence, followed by the deep, mournful groan of collapsing stone. The dam wall cracks, then fails. An inland sea is suddenly unshackled. A dark tidal wave of 160 million tons of water crashes into the Ruhr Valley, swallowing rail lines, factories, barracks, and the lives of over 1,000 German soldiers and civilians alike. Gibson's Lancaster banks hard, trailing the curve of the hillside. Through the intercom, he calls out to the next crew. Target breached. Repeat, the Mona is breached. Proceed to eat her. The first dam had fallen, 2 more to go. In bunkers and control towers across western Germany, phones ring, radios hiss, confusion reigns. The operators had been warned about Allied bombers before American fortresses by day, British Wellingtons by night. But this wasn't like any previous raid. It was too fast, too precise, and most damning of all, no one had seen them coming. The bombers that struck tonight didn't fly in swarms at 20,000 feet. They skimmed the treetops, invisible to radar, flying under the range of German 88mm flak batteries. Their target, infrastructure so vital that even the Luftwaffe hadn't dared believe it could be hit. And the aircraft responsible? A so-called flying barn, the Avro Lancaster. To German observers, the nickname made sense. The Lancaster was tall, wide, and rectangular, with a bulbous midsection and long wings that seemed to sag under their own weight. Its silhouette lacked the sleek menace of a Heinkel or the dart-like elegance of a mosquito. At over 69 feet long and 102 feet in wingspan, it resembled a floating warehouse more than a warplane. But that appearance hid a monster. With 4 1,460 horsepower Merlin engines, the same that powered Spitfires, the Lancaster could carry more than 14,000 pounds of bombs, nearly 3 times as much as the American B-17. It could be modified to fly at low level or cruise high above the Reich, and its cavernous bomb bay could accommodate innovations like the Tall Boy, the Grand Slam, or tonight's secret weapon, the bouncing bomb. Tonight, in the skies over the Ruhr Valley, the Luftwaffe realized that the Lancaster was not what it seemed. In one of the few surviving German air raid reports from that night, a flak battery commander near Neheim wrote, "The enemy aircraft did not come from above. They came from between the hills. We did not see them until the explosions. Our guns could not depress to fire. The dam was gone before the alarm finished sounding." That report would be read weeks later by interrogators at Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's primary POW camp. Dozens of captured German aircrew were being asked what they knew about the RAF's newest tactics. Many scoffed at the Lancaster's shape, its sluggish look. But by June, the laughter had stopped. Operation Chastise had crippled German war production for weeks and forced the relocation of entire labor forces. The raid had also proven that the Lancaster was far more than a payload hauler. It was an instrument of surgical destruction. Back in England, the headlines celebrated the feat. The Daily Mail ran the front-page headline, "Dams smashed by bouncing bombs." But for the men who flew, there was no triumph. Of the 19 Lancasters that launched that night, 8 never returned. 53 men were killed. Their aircraft caught by flak, cliffs, or mechanical failure lay shattered across the German countryside. Yet, among those who survived, a myth was born. They had made the impossible real. They had flown a flying barn straight into the heart of the Reich, and they had knocked down a wall. By late 1943, the German night sky had changed. It no longer whispered with the distant hum of solitary Wellingtons or the scattered drone of Halifaxes. Now it throbbed deeply, steadily, with the thunder of 4 synchronized Merlin engines. Every time that sound rose in the dark, German civilians and flak crews alike would glance upward and wonder, is it a Lancaster? Because if it was, something important was about to be destroyed. It wasn't supposed to be this way. To many Luftwaffe strategists, the Lancaster was a contradiction. Its frame was enormous, a bulking shadow that seemed almost inviting to searchlights and night fighters. It lumbered through the air like a floating cathedral, its belly heavy with bombs, its turrets often undergunned compared to American B-17 seconds. It should have been a perfect target. But time and again, it slipped past the defenses. Not because it was invisible, but because it refused to die. The Lancaster was built around one principle: payload. Where other bombers balanced bomb load, armor, and crew comfort, the Lancaster prioritized destructive force. Its designers at Avro didn't concern themselves with self-sealing fuel tanks or heavy armor plating. Instead, they relied on the dark and on the skill of its pilots. The aircraft would strike hard and get out fast. Simple in theory, deadly in practice. The statistics told a brutal story. By the end of 1943, Lancasters had flown over 30,000 sorties. They dropped more than 100,000 tons of bombs. But more chilling for the Luftwaffe were the targets: Hamburg, Berlin, the Ruhr, and always at night, always in waves. When the Battle of Hamburg began in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, the Luftwaffe, was still reeling from the Dambusters raid. But Gomorrah was different. This was not precision. This was annihilation. Over the course of 7 nights, Lancaster formations pounded Hamburg with wave after wave of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. The RAF flew by moonlight, through jamming clouds of radar-confusing window-thin strips of aluminum foil dropped by the millions. German defenses were blinded, and the fires lit by the Lancasters turned whole city blocks into charred wastelands. A firestorm consumed Hamburg on the night of July 27th. The temperature on the ground reached over 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt boiled, glass melted, concrete turned to powder. When it was over, more than 40,000 people were dead. Survivors described entire neighborhoods vanishing into glowing craters. The fire didn't just burn homes, it devoured oxygen. It pulled children out of their mothers' arms. It suffocated entire cellars of families hiding from the blasts. And always, always there was that low, terrible hum overhead. From his logbook, Flight Lieutenant Peter Bonnet of No. 460 Squadron RAF wrote, "We were called the Barns by the Germans. They laughed at how big we were. But that night over Hamburg, there was no laughter, just silence and smoke. For German night fighter crews, the Lancaster was both opportunity and nightmare. Fast enough to outrun some interceptors, big enough to fight back if cornered. Its silhouette became the most hunted shape in the sky. The Luftwaffe's best men, like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, trained obsessively to track and destroy them. Schnaufer, known as the Ghost of Street Trond, would go on to shoot down over 100 Allied bombers, most of them at night. But even he admitted in post-war interviews that the Lancaster was never an easy kill. They were vast, he said, but they flew with courage. Often they flew straight into our teeth and still dropped their bombs. The Lancaster's crews knew the odds. Bomber Command had one of the highest casualty rates of any Allied unit in the war. A new crewman had only a 30% chance of surviving a full 30-mission tour. Every flight was a coin toss with death. Still, they flew. Not because they had faith in steel or strategy, but because every time a Lancaster got through, a munitions factory stopped producing, a railway hub collapsed, an oil refinery burned. The aircraft's sheer adaptability only increased its legend. The same airframe that carried bouncing bombs over the Ruhr would soon carry 12,000-pound tallboys, and later the monstrous 22,000-pound Grand Slam. Where other bombers needed years of redesign, the Lancaster needed only a new bomb bay mount. It became the chosen tool for every impossible mission. Bridge at Arnsberg? Flattened. U-boat pens at Farge? Penetrated. V-weapon bunkers hidden beneath reinforced concrete? Smashed. The flying barn had become a siege weapon. In Germany's cities, it gained another name. Der Nachtbomber, the night bomber, a shape that haunted dreams, a sound that emptied shelters and froze firefighters. A machine that didn't just drop bombs, it carved scars into a nation's memory. Yet for all its destructive might, it wasn't invincible. Entire squadrons were sometimes lost. Lancasters came back riddled with holes, missing tail fins, dragging one engine on fire. Some landed with blood pooling in the fuselage. Silent men slumped in their seats, frozen where they'd died. But when one Lancaster went down, two more followed it into the dark, relentless, undeterred. In Flensburg, a captured Luftwaffe radio operator was asked during interrogation what he thought of Allied bombers. He answered plainly, "We do not fear the American flying fortress. It is strong, yes, but the Lancaster strikes where we are not ready. It flies from the shadows and leaves only ruin." In the ruins of Cologne, in the smoldering rubble of Kassel, in the shattered rail yards of Darmstadt, the name meant one thing: death from the dark. And so the flying barn, once mocked, became feared, not for its looks, but for its silence after the bombs fell. Darkness was supposed to be a shield. That was the logic behind Bomber Command's doctrine: strike at night, when the enemy can't see you. But by late 1943, that shield had been pierced. The Germans had adapted. The night sky had become a battlefield of unseen shapes and whispered death. And in that black arena, the Lancaster met its deadliest enemy, not the flak gun, not the siren, but the twin-engine Predator, the Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter. At first glance, it seemed a mismatch. The Lancaster was huge, slow, and easy to silhouette. The Bf 110 was fast, radar-equipped, and deadly. But what played out in the skies over Europe was not a slaughter, it was a duel. The Germans had perfected the Kammhuber line, a series of overlapping radar fields and night fighter zones stretching from Denmark to northern France. Each zone was patrolled by fighters guided by ground stations. They waited in silence until the radar operator whispered coordinates, and then they climbed. What followed was pure chaos. A Bf 110 pilot might spot a formation of Lancasters silhouetted by searchlights or glowing faintly against a backdrop of fires. With its SN2 radar, the night fighter would close in from beneath or behind, slipping through the gaps in the bomber stream. And then the Schräge Musik, an upward-firing cannon system mounted at a diagonal angle in the Bf 110's fuselage. Schräge Musik allowed German pilots to rake a Lancaster's belly with 20mm or 30mm shells without ever being seen. There was no warning, no tracer arc, just a sudden jolt, then fire. Tail gunners screamed over the intercom. Some Lancaster crews jettisoned their bombs early. Others simply vanished, plummeting as a burning comet into the black fields below. The losses were staggering. On the 30th of March 1944, during a raid on Nuremberg, Bomber Command sent out 795 aircraft, most of them Lancasters. That night, 96 were shot down, many by night fighters using schräge Musik. Over 500 men did not return. Veteran pilot squadron leader John Mackenzie later recalled, "We couldn't fight what we couldn't see. One second we were joking over the intercom, the next our mid-upper gunner was gone. Just gone." The psychological toll was immense. Crews began taping photos of lost friends above their stations. Superstitions flourished. Some refused to shave before missions. Others kept small tokens, a coin, a ribbon, a letter. Anything to hold on to something human amid the cold arithmetic of attrition. Still, the Lancaster crews adapted. They flew tighter formations. Rear and mid-upper gunners coordinated arcs of fire. Some aircraft flew as spoilers, deliberately drawing fire to allow others to slip through. Radar countermeasures improved. Chaff called window was dropped in cascading sheets to confuse German radar. Jamming frequencies were altered nightly, and the Germans, for all their ferocity, couldn't be everywhere. By early 1944, Lancaster crews began to give their aircraft names that blended defiance and gallows humor. Satan's Lady, Friday the 13th, Just Jane, Uninvited Guest. Each name painted on the fuselage in white or red, some with pin-up art, others with bomb tallies scrawled below. Each one told a story. Each one dared fate to come again. But the most feared missions weren't just those into deep Germany. They were the ones targeting defended rail yards, industrial complexes, and launch sites on the Channel coast. Those were flak traps. Night fighters were dense there, and searchlights were coordinated in deadly webs. Over the city of Kiel, Lancaster crews flew into such a net in April 1944. Sergeant Thomas Bell, a bomb aimer from 626 Squadron, described the experience in a letter never mailed. "We were hit 3 times before we even reached the target. The flak tore through the nose shrapnel in the floor, smoke in the bay. But the worst part? When the lights found us. A full cone, white like judgment. We felt naked up there. I saw the shadow of a fighter pass under us. We knew. We all knew." Bell's crew dropped their payload and limped home, 2 engines gone, hydraulic lines severed. They landed in southern England with only 1 man uninjured. And yet, the very next night, they flew again. Why? Because every Lancaster lost meant less pressure on German industry. And every one that got through meant another oil refinery in flames, a chemical plant offline, a locomotive yard twisted into steel ribbons. The Lancaster was not a fortress. It was a blade, sharpened on the anvil of repeated failure, then driven home night after night, regardless of the cost. German intelligence analysts, by 1944, began to treat the Lancaster as the central pillar of Bomber Command. They noted its growing modifications: jettison tanks for longer range, H-2S ground mapping radar for improved navigation, new turrets, and bomb types. They tracked squadron movements and even intercepted RAF radio chatter. But no amount of analysis could stop the Lancaster from coming. At the tactical debriefings of Luftwaffe night fighter Gruppen, questions were raised. Why are our intercepts declining? Why can't we stop more of them? The answer was brutal. Bomber Command had accepted the loss rate as the cost of strategic bombing. The British High Command, especially Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, believed that breaking Germany's will required the destruction of its capacity to wage war, no matter the price. And the Lancaster was the only aircraft that could deliver that destruction with such scale, reach, and flexibility. To the Germans on the ground, it became more than a machine. It became a symbol, a slow, barn-shaped phantom that passed overhead with the promise of fire. It rumbled low enough for villagers to hear the mechanical rhythm of its engines, but high enough to remain untouchable. Children would count them. Adults would pray through them. Soldiers would freeze when they heard them because they knew what followed. And so, the flying barn earned its second nickname not from its shape, but from its impact: Der Fluch der Nacht, the curse of the night. By 1944, the war in Europe was tilting. The Allies were pushing into France after D-Day. The Soviets were hammering eastward toward Berlin. But the skies over Germany? They still belonged to the Lancaster. Only now it was evolving into something even more terrifying. The Royal Air Force had spent years refining its approach to strategic bombing. But what began as broad, area-focused destruction was beginning to sharpen into something far more surgical. And no aircraft was better suited to this shift than the Avro Lancaster. The transformation began in a small design office in England, where engineer Barnes Wallis, the same mind behind the Dambusters bouncing bomb, had been obsessing over a new concept. He believed the most effective way to destroy hardened targets wasn't from above, it was from below. Instead of hitting bunkers or viaducts directly, he wanted to shake them to death, like striking a tuning fork so hard it fractures. To do that, you'd need an enormous bomb. He called it the Tall Boy, a 12,000-pound deep penetration weapon designed to fall from high altitude at transonic speeds. Its tail fins were precisely calculated. Its casing was steel. It wasn't designed to scatter destruction across a city block. It was designed to punch through concrete, explode underground, and trigger an earthquake effect. The Lancaster was the only aircraft in the Allied arsenal capable of carrying it. Not even the American B-17 Flying Fortress could manage it without heavy structural modifications. The Lancaster's vast bomb bay, long fuselage, and high lift-to-weight ratio made it the ideal delivery system. The first operational use of the Tall Boy came in June 1944 against the Saumur railway tunnel in occupied France. German forces were preparing to send reinforcements to fight the D-Day landings. The tunnel, buried beneath a hill and believed to be invulnerable, was a perfect target. The Lancasters struck at dusk. Tall Boys dropped from 18,000 feet, falling almost silently. One penetrated the hillside and detonated inside the tunnel, collapsing it entirely. The reinforcements never arrived. That night, Allied commanders realized they now had a weapon that could change the outcome of the war and a bomber capable of delivering it with terrifying precision. By late summer, the weapon had a new target: the German U-boat pens. These enormous submarine bunkers, built from reinforced concrete several meters thick, had been nearly impervious to traditional bombing. They sheltered the Kriegsmarine's deadliest weapons, the U-boats that had sunk thousands of Allied ships in the Atlantic. But concrete was no match for physics. In July 1944, 617 Squadron, now synonymous with elite Lancaster operations, was sent to destroy the U-boat pens at Brest. On board, Tall Boys. At 15,000 feet, the bombers released. The weapons fell like spears, piercing through meter-thick reinforced slabs. Several exploded deep underground, triggering collapses that turned command centers into rubble-filled tombs. The damage was so severe that some U-boat pens were abandoned mid-construction. Others had to be reinforced with even more concrete, a logistical nightmare for a crumbling German economy. Suddenly, it wasn't just German cities that were vulnerable. It was their fortresses. But Wallis wasn't finished. As the war pressed forward, his team produced something even more devastating: the Grand Slam, a 22,000-pound bomb. It was so heavy that the Lancasters carrying it had to be specially modified. Turrets were removed, armor stripped, fuel loads reduced. The aircraft became flying launch platforms for the most destructive non-nuclear bomb ever used in the war. Only the Lancaster could do it. No other Allied bomber, British or American, had the structural integrity or space. The Grand Slam made its debut in March 1945 against the Bielefeld Viaduct, a key German railway bridge. The goal was not to hit the bridge directly, but to collapse the ground beneath its supports. It worked. When the bomb detonated underground, the resulting shockwave shattered the stone columns. The entire bridge folded in on itself. Luftwaffe engineers later found no debris from the Grand Slam itself. It had buried itself too deep. The only evidence was the shattered landscape and the complete destruction of the viaduct. For the men flying these missions, the stakes remained high. Modified Tall Boy and Grand Slam Lancasters were sitting ducks. Without turrets, they had no defensive firepower. If intercepted, they had only speed and altitude. They flew in pairs or small waves, in silence, at night or at dawn, always with one goal: destroy what no one else could. Each mission felt like a gamble, but the rewards were immense. In one instance, 617 Squadron dropped tall boys on the Chems Dam in October 1944. The Germans had expected the dam to hold against any bombing. They were wrong. The tall boys punched straight through the structure and detonated near its foundation. Within minutes, the dam collapsed. Entire German divisions were left without hydroelectric power. It crippled factory production for weeks. A Luftwaffe field engineer, captured weeks later, said this during interrogation. "We knew the Lancaster, but these new bombs, they frightened even our officers. There was no defense, no delay, only the ground trembling beneath our feet, and then nothing." The final months of the war saw the Lancaster become more than just a bomber. It was a psychological weapon. German soldiers and civilians alike began to associate the sound of 4 Merlins, not just with fire from above, but with the collapse of things they believed were permanent. Bridges, dams, tunnels, fortresses. The barn-like plane that once inspired jokes had become an icon of devastation. At night, German radio operators would listen for the rumble. Flak crews would count seconds between the radar pings and the distant hum. Entire cities would go dark the moment Lancaster formations were detected. And the bombs they carried, Tallboy, Grand Slam, and the thousands of standard loads still in use continued to carve the path toward victory. No longer just the workhorse of bomber command, now the hammer of Allied air power. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. From the east, Soviet divisions were grinding forward through the ruins of Poland. From the west, American and British troops were crossing the Rhine. German cities lay shattered. Fuel was scarce. Morale was lower than at any point in the war. And yet the Lancasters kept coming, night after night. Even as German air defenses fell apart, even as flak crews were replaced by Hitler Youth and Volkssturm conscripts, even as the once fearsome Luftwaffe splintered into scattered, starving remnants, the rumble of 4 Merlin engines over the rooftops still struck fear. It wasn't just about infrastructure anymore. By 1945, the bombing campaign had taken on another purpose: to ensure the complete disintegration of Germany's capacity to resist, and to deny the Nazis even the fantasy of prolonging the war. The weapon of choice remained the Avro Lancaster. This wasn't the sleek, clean aircraft that had danced over the Ruhr 2 years earlier. These were scarred machines, riveted patches over old flak holes, nose art faded from weather and blood, gun barrels blackened from hundreds of missions. And inside them, the crews were now veterans, the ones who'd survived tour after tour. Some were on their 50th mission. They didn't speak much before takeoff anymore. They sat on crates and smoked. They buckled their harnesses like men climbing the gallows. They had seen the cost. Berlin. For years it had been a psychological fortress as much as a physical one. Hitler's seat of power. A city armored not just with flak towers and radar nets, but with propaganda, the capital of the 1,000-year Reich. Bomber Command had been hitting it for months in waves, but now the pressure intensified. In one of the largest Lancaster raids of the war, March 1945, saw over 1,000 RAF bombers, the vast majority of them Lancasters, strike the capital in a single night. They carried a mix of high explosives and incendiaries. The tactic was deliberate. First, the bombs would blast holes in water mains and destroy fire brigades. Then the incendiaries would ignite the wood, the fuel, the ancient beams of Berlin's pre-war neighborhoods. The firestorm theory, once tested in Hamburg, was now perfected in Berlin. Neighborhoods vanished. Entire streets buckled as underground gas lines erupted in flames. Eyewitnesses described the air itself catching fire, people suffocating not from smoke, but from lack of oxygen as the heat consumed every breathable molecule. From the air, the bomb aimers could see the flames piercing the clouds like orange spears. Even at 20,000 feet, the heat created updrafts that rocked the aircraft. Flight Sergeant Alan Croft of 101 Squadron later recalled, "It looked like hell had broken open. There were entire districts glowing like a forge. You could see the dome of the Reichstag pulsing in the glow. We all went quiet, not from fear, just awe." Despite its damage, Berlin was still protected. Massive flak towers, built of reinforced concrete, rose from the city like monoliths. Each tower bristled with 88mm guns, 20mm autocannons, and radar equipment. They were designed to be impregnable, both fortresses and air defense platforms. But nothing was impregnable anymore. In the final months, tallboy bombs and eventually grand slams were dropped on targets around Berlin's infrastructure, railway hubs, bridges, and communication centers. They didn't just destroy buildings, they shook foundations, ruptured tunnels, and caved in bunkers once thought indestructible. The Germans called the Lancaster raids Todesritt durch die Nacht, the death ride through the night. At ground level, there was no defense. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a ghost. There were too few aircraft, too little fuel, and too many fronts to defend. Fighters scrambled to intercept the incoming bombers, but were often too late, too few, or simply bypassed. Even when the radar stations gave warning, the response came too slow. One German night fighter pilot, Oberleutnant Karl Friedrich Rombach, was captured in April 1945. During interrogation, he was asked if the Lancaster was still considered a threat. He didn't hesitate. "We feared it more than the fortress. The fortress came in daylight. You could fight it. But the Lancaster came in darkness. You heard it, but you didn't see it. And when you did see it, it was too late." Even as Berlin was being consumed from within, the Allied High Command understood the symbolism of the raids. The Lancaster wasn't just a tool of war, it was now a hammer, driving the last nails into the coffin of the Reich's delusions. By April, as Soviet tanks pushed into Berlin from the east, the RAF prepared one final symbolic strike. The target, Hitler's personal bunker complex and the last functioning government installations nearby. Lancasters were loaded with tallboys and 4,000-pound cookies, massive blast bombs designed to level structures in seconds. Though the exact impact of the final raids was difficult to assess due to Soviet occupation, what is known is this: even in its final days, even with Berlin already dying from within, the sight of black, barn-sized shadows crawling across the night sky sent thousands fleeing for the shelters one last time. The Lancaster's silhouette had become a prophecy, one that always preceded collapse. In the ruins of the city, where broken bricks formed hills and smoke turned the moon red, survivors crawled from cellars and basements. Children wept. Firemen dug with bare hands. Nurses carried wounded through firelit streets. And through it all, some still looked skyward. Not with hatred, not even with fear anymore, but with the numb recognition of a people who knew the war was lost, and that a machine once mocked as awkward, as slow, as a flying barn, had helped end it. The Avro Lancaster may have been built for destruction, but inside its cold aluminum frame lived something much more fragile. 7 young men, each with a role, each with a burden, and each painfully aware that the odds were stacked against them. To the outside world, the Lancaster was a symbol of power, but for the men inside, it was a cage of fire and ice, roaring across the sky at 200 miles per hour with no heat, no insulation, and no forgiveness. The average crewman was just 21 years old. At the nose sat the bomb aimer, hunched in a glass blister, lying flat on his stomach, staring through a bomb sight as cities passed beneath him like distant constellations. Above and behind him, the navigator pored over maps and instruments, working under red lights to trace invisible threads through the black. Midway up the fuselage sat the pilot and flight engineer, the only two who stood upright for most of the mission. The pilot was the captain, usually the eldest by a year or two. The flight engineer monitored fuel, engines, hydraulics, all of it manually. There was no autopilot worth trusting. Every button mattered. Farther back, the wireless operator sat beside a radio that crackled and hissed, decoding Morse in midair. Just behind him, the mid-upper gunner crouched in a perspex turret, scanning for the flash of incoming tracers. And finally, in the tail, the loneliest place on Earth, sat the rear gunner. They called it the coffin position. A plexiglass dome exposed on all sides. No armor, no exit. Just 303 machine guns in the night. If a Lancaster was hit from behind, and many were, the rear gunner was often the first to die. Conditions on board were brutal. At 20,000 feet, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Oxygen masks iced over. Fingers went numb inside electrically heated gloves that rarely worked. The engines were deafening, a constant, bone-vibrating growl that made normal conversation impossible. And then there was the flak. When a Lancaster flew into a barrage, it felt like being trapped inside a steel drum while someone beat it with hammers. Shrapnel tore through fuselages like paper. A single hit could shear off a wing, ignite the bomb bay, or slice a gunner clean in half. Yet somehow they kept flying. Crew cohesion was everything. Many Lancaster crews were formed in training and stayed together for every mission. They knew each other's rhythms, jokes, silences. Some came from mining towns, some from Canadian farms, some from universities. But once aboard, none of that mattered. They were one machine as finely tuned as the aircraft itself. Sergeant Michael Mick Hardy, a rear gunner from 49 Squadron, once wrote in his journal, "The bomber shakes and roars and freezes your bones, but it's your mates that keep you warm. We don't fly for medals. We fly because we don't want to be the one who lets the others down." Loss was constant. They didn't talk about it much, but every crew knew they were part of a rotating roster of death. The chalkboard in the briefing room told the story last night's missing. New names. Replacements already arriving. In 1943 alone, Bomber Command lost over 2,300 Lancasters. More than 10,000 crewmen were killed, most of them never found. Their names are etched into memorials in Runnymede, Ottawa, and Christchurch. But during the war, they were simply failed to return. There were no eulogies, just empty chairs in the mess hall. Still, the crews found ways to cope. They painted names on their aircraft, often in dark humor. Gone with the Wind. No reply at all. Tired Teddy. They chalked up bomb silhouettes beneath the cockpit to count their missions. They carried mascots, lucky coins, rabbit's feet, tiny teddy bears sewn into flight suits. One crew flew with a small wooden gnome wired to the instrument panel. Another brought along a stuffed monkey named Bomber. Each item was a talisman against fate, an anchor in a world that had become increasingly random. When a Lancaster crew completed a full 30-mission tour, they were considered veterans, survivors. They were often pulled from combat and reassigned as instructors, but some chose to go back, not out of duty to king or country, but out of loyalty to the only family they had left. Flight Lieutenant James Rawlings, a pilot from 61 Squadron, returned for a second tour in late 1944. He was offered a desk. He declined. They were sending kids up with no guidance, no voice in the intercom when the sky turned red. Someone had to be there who knew the difference between flak bursts and a failing engine. On his 43rd mission, his Lancaster was hit over Dortmund. He ordered his crew to bail out. He stayed at the controls. The aircraft crashed in a forest near Essen. Rawlings's body was found days later, still strapped in, hands on the yoke. These stories, the silent courage, the bonds forged in smoke and frost, are often lost in the shadow of tonnage dropped or targets destroyed. But they mattered, because the Lancaster was not just rivets and engines. It was the sum of its crew. Every bomb dropped on a rail yard, every viaduct split, every dam cracked open, it all depended on 7 young men trusting each other to do the impossible. In the dark, at speed, under fire. They weren't heroes in their own minds. They were scared, tired, often angry. But they flew because no one else could do what they did. And when the night sky lit up with flak and fire, and the ground seemed to rise to meet them, they flew anyway. That's what made the Lancaster more than a machine. It was a flying barn, yes. But inside that barn were Lyon. By the final winter of the war, something had shifted, not just in the Allied command centers or in the ruins of cities, but in the minds of the men who had once believed the Reich was untouchable. The Luftwaffe had once ruled the skies over Europe with impunity. In 1940, its Stukas screamed over Belgium, its Messerschmitts sliced through France, and its bombers turned Coventry to rubble. But by 1945, that confidence had fractured. And behind that fracture, lurking in the blackened skies, was the outline of a bomber that once made German gunners laugh out loud. Now it made them whisper. Captured Luftwaffe pilots at Dulag Luft, the main German aircrew interrogation center, began to express a consistent theme by late 1944. Their comments, taken from hundreds of transcripts, painted a portrait not just of military fatigue, but of a growing psychological pressure that couldn't be explained by strategy alone. It was the Lancaster effect. One German night fighter crewman, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Dietrich, captured after being shot down over the Ardennes, described it simply: "The Lancaster made no sense to us at first. It was large, yes, but not heavily armed. It flew high, but not the highest. It seemed to dare us to shoot it down. And when we tried, it kept coming. More of them. Every night. You kill one. 5 return." Others were more specific. Dietrich's pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Leber, told British interrogators, "The British knew how to bleed us. We could track the fortresses. We knew when the Americans came. But the Lancasters came at night in silence, always when we were weakest. Sometimes we would hear the engines and never find them. Other times they would vanish into the jamming fields. The ground would shake an hour later. We called them Die Schwarzen Kühe, the black cows, because they looked slow. But they were unstoppable." It wasn't just bomber crews that noticed. German civilians, many of whom had lived through years of Allied air raids, began associating different feelings with different bombers. The high-pitched whine of a mosquito meant a fast, sharp strike. The deep, thundering pulse of American B-17 seconds came with daylight, with smoke and sirens. But the Lancaster had its own presence, a slower, rolling rhythm of engines, a crawling approach that built dread as it grew louder, and always in darkness. Even without seeing them, people began to feel them. In diary entries recovered from destroyed homes and burned-out apartments, German civilians used strikingly similar language. The same words returned again and again: heaviness, dread, black wings, the sound that meant fire. One entry, written by a schoolteacher in Kassel in March 1944, read, "Tonight, I hear them again. The sound comes like a low thunder, but different, as if the sky itself is groaning. My son says they are the barn bombers. I tell him to pray. He says he cannot hear God over the noise." Inside German flak units, the mood was no better. By late 1944, most of the experienced gunners had been killed or rotated to the Eastern Front. Many of the anti-aircraft crews now included 15 and 1 6-year-old Hitler Youth members. Some had been trained for barely 2 weeks before being placed on 88mm guns in the path of incoming bomber streams. They fired because they were told to, but they rarely hit anything. Sergeant Otto Helmke, a captured flak battery NCO from Cologne, told interrogators, "When the Lancasters came, we just fired. We didn't even aim. The searchlights couldn't catch them, too many, too fast, too well coordinated. Sometimes they dropped chaff, sometimes nothing. We didn't know if they were really there until we saw the fire." RAF countermeasures had made the bomber stream a ghost army. The Lancaster's role in this illusion was key. It carried window bundles of aluminum strips and dropped them in waves, confusing radar and convincing German crews that they were surrounded by dozens more aircraft than actually present. In some raids, 3 squadrons could simulate an entire wing. The confusion had a cumulative effect. By 1945, some flak crews fired into empty sky for 20 minutes after the last bomber had gone. Still, there were moments of retaliation. German night fighters, especially the elite crews flying Ju 88 seconds and Bf 110 seconds, developed tactics to cut through the chaos. They stalked the bomber stream from below or behind, using radar and visual cues. If they reached firing position undetected, the result was devastating. One burst from Schrager-Music could ignite the Lancaster's central fuselage, or worse, detonate its bomb load in midair. But even the best German aces acknowledged the difficulty of breaking the bomber stream. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the top-scoring night fighter ace of the war with 121 victories, told post-war interviewers something that echoed among Allied analysts. "We hunted the Lancaster because it was our greatest threat, but it hunted us too. Not with guns, with persistence. It never stopped. And when you shoot down 5, 6 take its place. That is not tactics, that is resolve." Schnaufer's fear was echoed in a now declassified 1945 Luftwaffe operations report recovered near Augsburg. The enemy's heavy night bombers, particularly the Lancaster, remain the most consistent threat to strategic infrastructure. Their range, payload, and nighttime deployment render most defensive operations ineffective. Morale among ground crews is declining. Confidence in victory is fading. This was the turning point. The Lancaster, once dismissed as an oversized boxcar in the sky, had outlasted ridicule. Its design hadn't changed dramatically, but its purpose had evolved, and so had its reputation. To the Allies, it was now the symbol of perseverance. To the Germans, it was the sound that came before the sirens, the shape that appeared in the sky when defenses were weakest, and hope had already begun to fail. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't armored like the American Flying Fortress. But in the closing chapters of the European War, the Lancaster had become something else entirely. It was inevitability with wings. For all the Lancaster's power, for all the bridges it collapsed, dams it shattered, and cities it set ablaze, there was a hidden ledger being written alongside every mission. A ledger not of bombs dropped, but of men lost. And by 1945, that ledger had become impossible to ignore. RAF Bomber Command, the backbone of the Allied night offensive, had suffered some of the heaviest losses of any British military branch during the entire war, and no aircraft carried more of that burden than the Avro Lancaster. Of the 7,377 Lancasters built, over 3,300 were lost in operations. That's nearly half. But even more haunting than the wrecked aircraft were the numbers etched into stone, the crewmen who never returned. More than 55,000 aircrew from Bomber Command were killed in action. The vast majority flew aboard Lancasters. They died in burning cockpits, in frozen skies, in parachutes that didn't open, or in bomb bays that exploded mid-flight. For every bridge the Lancaster dropped, it left blood in its wake. The average life expectancy of a new Lancaster crewman in 1943 was just 2 weeks. Crews were required to complete a 30-mission tour. If they survived, they could rotate to training duties or volunteer for a second tour. Many never made it past 5, and those who did survive rarely escaped untouched. Pilot Officer Graham Parker, who flew 33 missions with 626 Squadron, once said, "I never got used to the flak. You'd hear it tearing the air, feel the thump as it hit the fuselage. But what haunted me most was the silence after. When you called out to your crew and one of them didn't answer. They weren't all killed instantly. Some bled out in the fuselage. Others died days later in field hospitals from burns, frostbite, or shock. There were missions where the only surviving member was the rear gunner, trapped in the tail section that somehow broke off and glided down like a coffin with wings. For Bomber Command, the moral question started to surface even before the war ended. How much destruction was necessary? Were firebombing raids against civilian cities justified by military necessity? And was the human cost, both British and German, worth the strategic gain? The answers weren't simple. Supporters argued that the bombing campaign crippled German logistics, disrupted fuel and armament production, and forced Hitler to divert massive resources to air defense, including over 1 million soldiers and thousands of guns that could have fought on the Eastern Front or Normandy beaches. Critics pointed to Dresden. In February 1945, over 800 Lancasters took part in a massive bombing raid on the historic Saxon city, long considered a cultural gem of Europe. In the span of 2 nights, waves of incendiaries and high explosives leveled vast swaths of the city. The fires burned so hot that stone facades cracked and iron melted. Between 22,000 and 25,000 people were killed, many of them civilians, including refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. The attack sparked international outcry, even among some Allied commanders. To this day, Dresden remains one of the most controversial episodes in the history of strategic bombing. And at the center of it was the Lancaster. Inside Britain, families followed the war through telegrams and silence. A knock on the door, a black envelope, a letter beginning with, "The Air Ministry regrets to inform you." Some towns lost entire groups of boys. Streets once filled with bicycles and football matches became neighborhoods of widows and grieving mothers. But still, the bomber stream flew on. Because for the men of Bomber Command and for the Allied leaders guiding the war, the mission had to continue. Every railroad destroyed shortened the war. Every oil depot in flames meant fewer panzers at the front. And for the Germans, there was no rest. Even in 1945, as their cities crumbled and their leaders hid in bunkers, the sound of approaching Lancasters reminded them that the world had not forgotten their crimes. After the war, recognition for these sacrifices came slowly, too slowly. Unlike the fighter aces of the Battle of Britain, the bomber crews were not instantly celebrated. There were no ticker-tape parades for men who had reduced cities to ashes. The public mood had shifted. The firestorms, the casualty lists, and the images of scorched civilians made many uneasy. Bomber Command received no campaign medal. No monument was erected for decades. It wasn't until 2012, nearly 70 years after the war ended, that a national memorial was finally dedicated in London to honor the men of Bomber Command. It lists the names of the 55,573 airmen who never came home. Those names include Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Poles, and South Africans. The Lancaster was a British design, but it was flown by the Commonwealth, a shared burden among nations fighting a global war. Each name represents a boy who once crawled into a freezing fuselage, clipped on a parachute, checked his oxygen line, and took off into the night, never knowing if he'd see morning. And for every bridge the Lancaster broke, every dam it shattered, it carried that weight. The war could not have been won without it. But the cost of that victory, etched in shattered metal and quiet graves, remains one of the heaviest in the history of air warfare. In the end, the Lancaster didn't win the war by itself, but it broke the myth of Nazi invincibility. It tore apart the machine that built death camps, and it gave voice to the Allied promise that tyranny would not stand unchallenged. Even if that voice came as a distant, thunderous hum in the night sky, followed by silence and then fire. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. The guns fell silent. The skies cleared, and the bomber streams that once blackened the night over Germany began returning to their airfields one last time, not for battle, but for demobilization. The Avro Lancasters that rolled onto the tarmac in those final weeks were weathered, battered, and tired machines. Their paint faded, nose art chipped, gun barrels rusted from months of exposure and use. But for many crews, the most haunting thing wasn't the silence. It was the question, what now? For years, these men had lived in a rhythm of takeoff, target, return, or not. Some had flown 30, even 40 missions. Others had seen friends vanish into black clouds of flak or explode midair, their aircraft lit like matchsticks against the night sky. They had stared death in the face and survived. Now, with peace signed and the Lancaster's final wartime missions completed, the surviving aircraft sat idle on RAF airfields like Woodhall Spa, Scampton, and Binbrook. Mechanics packed up toolkits. Pilots handed over logbooks. Ground crews wept quietly as tail numbers were painted over. Some Lancasters were converted for transport. Others were sent to be scrapped. To many veterans, watching their aircraft dismantle a machine they had trusted with their lives was harder than expected. Flight engineer Harold Bostwick of 617 Squadron recalled the moment vividly. I walked past Lady Luck in the rain. She had a tarp over her nose. No guns, no bombs, just stillness. We flew 29 trips in her. She never let us down. I reached out, patted her fuselage, and said thank you. I don't care if it was just metal. She brought us home. But what did the Lancaster leave behind, not in the air, but on the ground? Across Germany, its legacy was written in brick and ash. In cities like Essen, Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin, post-war recovery revealed a map of broken infrastructure. Bridges were gone, rail lines torn up, power plants cratered, oil refineries in ruins. In the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, where Germany had once fueled its panzer divisions and V-weapon factories, over 60% of industrial capacity had been destroyed by 1945, much of it by Lancaster raids. Allied analysts reviewing captured documents and interviewing German planners after the surrender came to a stark conclusion. Germany's war machine didn't collapse all at once. It bled out over time, strike by strike, until it simply couldn't function anymore. And the instrument of that slow strangulation? The Lancaster bomber. But the war's end also brought new scrutiny. As the world emerged from the shadow of total war, questions rose about morality, proportionality, and legacy. The Lancaster, once praised as a hero of the skies, was now the subject of difficult conversations. Was the destruction of Dresden necessary? Did the campaign against civilian cities, which included deliberate firebombing tactics, cross a line? Could the same goals have been achieved with fewer deaths? Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the architect of Britain's strategic bombing doctrine and a fierce defender of the Lancaster's role, remained unapologetic to his dying day. He believed the campaign had shortened the war and saved lives by forcing an earlier German collapse. Many veterans agreed. But even among them, there was reflection, a sense of sorrow for what had been done, even if they still believed it had to be done. On the other side, in post-war Germany, memories of the Lancaster were more complicated. In interviews conducted in the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds, German civilians often recalled the bomber not with hatred but with a kind of solemn fear. Not the irrational fear of a monster, but the recognition of something inevitable. One survivor from Dresden, then a teenager, described it like this: "We heard them before we saw them. The sound rolled in like waves. You prayed they were passing, but when they circled back, you knew. It was not anger I felt. It was silence, the kind that comes when the sky falls. And yet, out of that destruction came something else: reconciliation." In the decades following the war, former Lancaster crewmen returned to Germany not as enemies, but as guests. Some met with survivors of their own bombing raids. Others helped build memorials, fund schools, and support reconciliation projects in cities their squadrons had once bombed. These moments were not always easy, but they were real. Back in Britain, the Lancaster began its second life, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Surviving aircraft were placed in museums. A few were restored to flying condition. The most famous of them, PA 474, became part of the RAF's Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, a soaring tribute to the sacrifices of aircrew on both sides. When it flies today, thousands come to watch. Children wave. Vétérans salutent. The sound of its 4 Merlin engines echoes across the fields and towns of peacetime England, not as a threat but as a memory. A living monument to the men who climbed into its belly and took flight, knowing full well they might never return. One inscription, carved into the Bomber Command Memorial in London, says it best: "The fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory." It was controversial then, it still is now, but history does not measure sacrifice by popularity. It measures it in blood, in courage, and in what endures long after the war is over. And what endures from the bombed cities to the quiet airfields, from the cracked sidewalks of Hamburg to the polished nose of a restored PA 474, is the story of a machine built to break things, flown by boys who held it together. The last operational Avro Lancaster bomber left frontline RAF service in 1954. By then, the world had changed. Jet engines had replaced propellers. The Cold War had begun. Nuclear bombs now weighed more than the Grand Slam and could erase cities in a single flash. The Lancaster, once the apex predator of the night sky, was being phased out gently, respectfully, like a warrior too old for the next fight. And yet, it never really disappeared. To this day, when people speak of the great bombers of the Second World War, the Lancaster holds a place all its own, not because it was beautiful or sleek or even the fastest, but because it got the job done, because it never flinched, and because it carried more than bombs. It carried resolve. It carried sacrifice. It carried home the wounded, the broken, the exhausted, and sometimes only memories. For those who flew her, the Lancaster was more than rivets and gauges. It had a personality, a rhythm, a presence that stuck with them long after the war ended. The smell of oil and canvas, the vibration in the floor as the Merlins turned over, the way the fuselage groaned under heavy load and sighed in relief during landing. Veterans who hadn't seen their aircraft in 50 years would break down when standing beside a restored one. They'd reach out, handshaking, and touch the cold skin of the fuselage like greeting an old friend. One they thought had been lost. One that remembered everything. Flight Lieutenant George Jock Henshaw, who flew 58 missions over occupied Europe, once described it like this: "The Lancaster never boasted. It just flew. It took what we gave it, fuel, bombs, fear, and it carried it into the teeth of the enemy. And most of the time, she brought us back. For the enemy, it left scars. Not just in cities or craters or bridges that no longer stood, but in the psyche." German post-war reconstruction had to grapple not only with physical rebuilding, but with the memory of that low rumble in the night sky. Generations later, elderly Germans still remembered crouching in cellars, hearing the slow, building roar as the bombers approached. And even now, in museums across Europe, children ask their grandparents, "Was it a Lancaster?" And sometimes, the answer is yes. But the Lancaster's story isn't one of vengeance. It is a story of choices made during total war of a nation that turned to a machine to carry its hopes for victory across enemy skies. It is also the story of the men who gave that machine meaning, because the Lancaster didn't choose its targets. People did, and people flew it. Its nickname, the Flying Barn, was born from contempt. German pilots mocked it for its size, for its shape, for its supposedly sluggish profile. And to a point, they were right. It wasn't nimble. It wasn't armored like an American flying fortress. It looked like it shouldn't survive a single mission. But it did. Again and again. And that's why, over time, the name changed in tone. From mockery to respect. Then from respect to fear. To the Luftwaffe, it became Der Nachthammer, the night hammer, the instrument that broke the silence, that shattered steel and stone, that wore down even the strongest will with its relentless return. And to the Allies, it became the symbol of strategic persistence, the aircraft that adapted, evolved, and rose to every demand the war required. From the Ruhr to Berlin, from the Dams raid to Dresden, from Tallboy to Grand Slam, it was there, delivering, enduring, burning, surviving. Today, only a handful of Lancasters still exist. Two fly regularly, one in Britain, the other in Canada. When they take to the sky, people stop what they're doing. Heads tilt up. Conversations fall quiet. The sound of those 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines rolling in unison is unlike anything else. Not a roar, not a hum. A presence. Deep, thunderous, familiar. It doesn't sound angry. It doesn't sound proud. It sounds inevitable. And that's what the Lancaster became. Not just a bomber, but a symbol of what had to be done when the world came apart. A machine forged in desperation. Honed by fire. Carried by courage. You can still stand beneath one. Walk around the landing gear. Look up into the bomb bay. Sit in the cockpit if you're lucky. Place your hand on the throttle quadrant and try to imagine what it was like to push forward at takeoff, knowing that flak, fighters, and fate waited on the other end of the night. You won't hear the flak, but maybe, just maybe, you'll hear something else. The hum of an engine at full throttle. The whisper of 7 men checking their gear. The voice of a pilot saying, "We're going in." And if you do, you'll understand why this awkward, boxy, brave machine outlived the war. Why it still flies in memory and steel. And why, no matter what they called it, the Flying Barn became the most feared bomber of them all.